Hi, thank you for joining me for Bible study. We're in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Don't normally like talking about money, but Martin Luther made the comment that there's three parts of a person that need to be converted: the heart, the mind, and the wallet. And so I guess it is kind of important to talk about these things. The Apostle Paul definitely had a lot to say about it. Jesus even had some to say about it. And boy, there's a lot in the law about it. So let's cover a little bit of what needs to be said. And so I picked 2 Corinthians 9 because it reveals a lot of the heart behind what is being said. And it kind of lends itself to what that earlier quote was about. So 2 Corinthians chapter 9, the context is that the church in Corinth had promised to gather an offering to give to the saints in Jerusalem and Judea who were living in poverty and excluded by their countrymen from really participating in the economy. And a famine comes upon the land, and so they're really suffering now. And so the Apostle Paul says, all right, let's get this together, because it's not where you can just wire the money to him or write a check and put it in the mail. Someone has to carry the cold, hard coinage from one part of the Roman Empire to another part of the Roman Empire. And so he had gathered up people to help do that from each of these churches in Macedonia and what is today Greece. And Corinth is one of those. And so he's kind of reminding him, all right, so this is coming up. And in verse 5, this is kind of where we're picking up in the conversation. He says, therefore I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren to go to you ahead of time and prepare your generous gift beforehand, which you had previously promised, that it may be ready as a matter of generosity and not as a grudging obligation. But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance of every good work. As it is written, he has dispersed abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed you've sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness, while you are being enriched in everything for all liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God. Now, he's a little poetic in there, so it may be kind of hard to follow his thought at times, but I hope the context helps. So when you read in verse 5 there, he says, so this is why I am sending people ahead of you. I thought it would be a really good idea just so you could be reminded it's coming. Let's be generous now, so that suddenly you're not surprised by these people coming saying, oh, great, I'm glad you've decided to give. He's given them time to get this together. He doesn't want it to be begrudging or an obligation where they feel like they had their arm behind their back twisted to do it, but a matter of generosity. A word that shows up a lot in this section here is generosity. And so it's worth noting, this is a special offering that they're giving. This isn't their usual offering that they give, which is hinted at in places like 1 Timothy 5 and 1 Corinthians 9, where he reminds both the Corinthians and Timothy that when the believers come together, they're supposed to be giving to God, to the church, and from that, the preaching pastor is to receive an honorarium, so to speak, to show honor to him. And that harkens back to the Old Testament law, where the Levite and the priest were to receive the first fruits and the tithe of the people. And that unpacks a whole different vein of thought, that this tithe is something that is, and first fruits is woven deep into the culture in the ancient Near East, not just among the God of Israel and his people. But it is notable, Jacob, as he was leaving the promised land to go flee from his brother, God had appeared to him at Bethel, and Jacob said, if you take care of me and bring me back to this place, then of all that you give me, I will give you back a tenth, a tithe. And so there it is, woven even in Genesis. And so then when we get to the law, we hear where both Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, there's a lot not said, so we know it's already in the culture that there's to be a giving to God, and it's a giving of a tenth of what one receives. And it would go to the Levite and to the priest, to the temple or tabernacle, as the case was. And in the case of the Levites, they lived there in the different towns or a neighboring town from where the people lived. They would give to the Levite, and every 3 years they would keep it there in their community to help feed the needy, the widows, the orphans, the immigrants that would help those who were in need, right? As well as the Levite. But it was also then other 2 years taken to the tabernacle where you could rejoice with God for the plenty. And in Deuteronomy, it's kind of funny how it's spelled out, but that the people are to say, as they gave their tithes, we were nobodies. We were outcasts. We were slaves. God richly has given to us, and now I'm in the promised land receiving the bounty just as God promised. And so I celebrate with God what he has given to me. And that celebrating with God of what was already given by God shows up when they built the tabernacle, right? Those were slaves, but somehow they had all these riches now from the Egyptians to give to God. I love how David says it in 1 Chronicles when the children of Israel were giving to the building of the temple to replace the tabernacle. David says, both riches and honor come from you, O God, and you reign over all. In your hand is power and might. In your hand is to make great and to give strength to all. Now therefore, O God, we thank you and praise your glorious name. But who am I, and who are my people, that we should be able to offer so willingly as this? For all things come from you, and of your own we have given you. We're just giving back to God what he already owned. He was just lending it to us. And so all of this is woven in to Paul's teachings. Do you see that? Where he says, we're given to God anyways, but this was something special you said you wanted to do. And so I want you to be able to cheerfully, gladly give because God has been generous to you in this way. And so generosity, well, God says, I want you to be generous. And now let's just walk through what he says here. Not begrudging, because generosity reflects an understanding of the natural order of sowing and reaping. Notice in verse 6, but this I say, he who sows sparingly will reap sparingly. He who sows generously will reap generously. If you only throw a few seeds on the ground, you'll only get a few plants, which will only produce a few fruit. But if you plant a big garden, And you're going to be like those folks that have so much that they keep giving it away to everyone they can. Same is true spiritually. If we only give a little, we only receive a little. But we give a lot, God gives generously. Notice in verse 7, so let each one give as he purposes in his heart. And so it's to be between you and God. It's your choice. And so I say this, while the tithe is an ancient practice that was woven into the culture of the time, we're not obligated. It's to be between you and God in giving. But it's a good benchmark, a good standard that is ancient and well tested. Giving a tenth of what God has given us. But it, by choice, could give more. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And you may have heard some preachers talk about how that's the word cheerful there that we get hilarious from. But really just talking about a merry giver, someone who has joy in their heart. Just as we saw in Deuteronomy and in those other places where we were to rejoice with the Lord in what he has given us. And to, as Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than to receive, as we hear in the book of Acts. We are just grateful to be able to give and to be generous. And we keep going here in verse 8. And God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. And so we can be generous knowing not only that it's by choice, but knowing that God enjoys it. God loves this. But we can also be generous knowing God rewards with grace. That's what verse 8 is getting there. God's able to make all grace abound. Now, this isn't to say that you give God $10, he'll give you 100. But it is to say that God's going to give rewards. And Jesus warned us, don't lay up treasures for yourselves on earth. It has a way of disappearing. Lay up rewards in heaven. And what exactly does that look like? We're not entirely explained that. But we do know it's a whole lot better than laying treasures up here on earth, where inflation eats and destroys, right? And so we can be generous knowing God rewards with grace, and that we'll have enough. We'll have all sufficiency, even abundance, to continue to do good works. Verse 9, as it is written, he's dispersed abroad, he's given to the poor. His righteousness endures forever. God looks out for the poor, and he does that through us. And then verse 10, now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed you have sown, increase the fruits of righteousness. But where did it come from? It came from God. He's the one who supplies the seed, doesn't he? That goes back to what David said, doesn't it? We're just giving back to God what he already owned. He had just lent it to us in the meantime. Hence the reason Jesus used the metaphor of us being stewards. It wasn't ours. It belongs to God. We're just holding it for him until we can give it back to him in whatever way or to use for his purposes. And then we can be generous knowing God receives the thanks. And that's what's cool about verse 11. That he says, well, you're enriched in everything for all liberality is what mine says, but it's just generosity, bountiful. This causes thanksgiving to abound to God. People will give thanks to God because of this. And that's really how this whole train of thought got started earlier in the week. Was that I was at a meeting and we were talking amongst us pastors, and some of the churches were the type to give a tithe of their offerings to missions. And our little church here is one of those that does that. And so we look like a very generous church towards missions, but it's because we're just giving back to God what was already His, and we did the formula just as God had set the pattern in the past. We give the 10th to Him. And so God has been generous to us, and it automatically, by formula, goes to His missions, goes to that. And then it also, that struck some people as kind of odd. That's interesting. Those who receive the tithes then tithe. Yeah, even like me. As a minister, I'm receiving because as God's people have given to the church, and the church decides to do that. And I'm very thankful for their generosity in that regard. And so I then tithe, just as the Levites were told in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that the tithes they received, they were to tithe on that to the temple, to the priests. And so they gave a tithe of the tithes. And that's what I do. I'm not real good at math, so I try to give a little more than that. But each week, because that's something else Paul explained in his letter to the Corinthians, on the first day of the week, give as you can. Don't put it off, because then it'll seem more begrudging. But give generously. And that's what I'm trying to do. Because I found that as I do that, then people give thanks to God that God has provided. Because God does provide. And that's why we pause to give thanks before a meal or something like that, right? And so I hope this has been an opportunity to kind of see how God gives. He wants us to be generous so that we can be generous to the needs of the church, giving to the needs of others. It's a part of the natural order of sowing and reaping. God rewards with grace. Just giving back to Him what was already His. And the thanks continues. So thank you for giving to God. Thank you for your support of this ministry. And thank you for your time. I hope you have had some food for thought, and we can follow through on what God has taught us today. So God bless, God keep you. We'll see you next time.